So yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Jans. I typed in Heidi, but please, anybody, let me know in the chat if there's a specific way you prefer me to refer to you. I go by she, her, and my name is pronounced Sonia Medel. And I'm speaking to everyone very gratefully on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples. And I agree with everything that you said. And I think there's so much power in what you shared, Dr. Jans. And I'm grateful to have learned from you today. I guess I'm going to take off exactly where you left off, and that is that inclusion and equity and diversity. We're at a moment in time right now where we have an opportunity to build this in, especially when we think of co-ops. Right from the outset and from the early planning stages versus look at it as an afterthought or something to be done midway. I am coming from the position of, I moved into a co-op when I was very young, a co-op that was formed in the early 80s. And I moved in the early 90s because a white member was very outspoken at the time that we should join in as members. My mom was a single parent. And through schools, I'd come into contact with that family. And at the time, I was one of two Latin American families. The other one was visibly white, and the rest of the co-op structure was white. So a lot of time has passed since then, and not much has changed in terms of disability, ability, racial and cultural makeup of the co-op. And I would say that this is a situation for most co-ops on the west side, especially on the west side of Vancouver, the Lower Mainland. I say this confidently because I have several friends now, all white except for one. I know of a couple that have recently joined other co-ops in West Side co-ops that are being very loud voices about speaking for inclusion and equity and the various aspects and what that means. But it's been a huge struggle. So I sort of come to share the voice of it's not as utopic as it seems unless everybody is really willing to have the really challenging conversations. So that means, yes, challenging what you said, Dr. Jans, ableism, understanding what that means. So one example is the co-op where I am is absolutely just at that first stage that you mentioned, where, you know, accessibility means a ramp and means counters at a certain height and doorknobs at a certain height. It didn't mean accessibility in the application format for membership. It doesn't mean accessibility in forming part of leadership. It doesn't mean accessibility in terms of accessing things in other parts of the building, for example, like washing machines. And this is for, so I was very loud in fighting for a couple to move in that was visibly Asian and also younger. So the other aspects are challenging racism, white privilege, and ageism. And I have been one of a few people that I know that have sent in emails to the CHFBC, which is the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC, explicitly sharing some of our experiences and the challenges. So I'm somebody that, thanks to my educational background, speaks English, am fluent and confident now speaking up for myself, can navigate websites, but still struggle, you know? And so when I think of new immigrants, the case of my mother, people with all sorts of ability, disability, challenges and dynamics. An example is also going on that webpage that they have, and there's this huge list of co-ops, and there's not a lot of options of how you can actually go in and see, you know, what units are available at co-ops, what services they offer in terms of accessibility and diversity. You essentially have to be somebody with good vision, auditory abilities, movement and navigation. And you go through a million loopholes. You know, the old format used to be you had to send in writing a request for an application, get that application back in a hard copy, fill it out, send it back in. Some co-ops have now become more accessible. We're one of those co-ops that are trying to have a version that's online, you know, cut back on the loopholes. but really we're so far off. And yeah, I speak from a position of somebody who, again, grew up here. I was one of the few youth that had an interest in joining the leadership of the co-op. So the committees that are more of the leadership would be board, finance, membership. And historically, there hadn't been, of the very few racialized peoples, very many on board. For example, my mother would have never thought to be on board because she wasn't supported to feel like she could be on the board, because of her English level, because of an understanding of how boards work in the Western democratic sense. I did join board, and I am currently on the membership committee. And so it's incredibly nerve-wracking and scary every time to be the only visibly racialized voice, speaking up for the fact that we don't have policies to, really include a greater diversity in our membership body. When we're looking through applications, when we, for example, have a stack of 5 able-bodied, white, middle to higher income families that are applying, and what are the factors that we would need to consider? And there are other then questions that come up. So how together collectively as a co-op structure do we understand what Dr. Jan's brought up, which is ableism, racism, again, white privilege and ageism, and all those other isms. And CHFBC's response in email format has been that, the great thing about co-ops is that we, or they, are independent. The downside is that although there's educational now workshops, and there's a plethora of them available online now. So, yes, there's strides and good steps on what equity is and what diversity is. Nobody can force the members to take this, right? I know that there's maybe less than a handful in the co-op that I live that willingly have engaged in this. And then, there's another co-op in False Creek right now, and they are looking for racialized families. And so they have talked about challenging racism and white privilege in each other. And I'm hearing from a white member, a friend, and also another student at UBC who's had other experiences with cooperative, how absolutely taxing and shocking this experience is for them right now at the moment. And so, that's a little bit, I guess, of the experience that I'm speaking from. I also have the experience of cooperatives from Latin America and from the indigenous community sense, indigenous Afro diverse senses in Latin America, the Occupy movement in Latin America, which has really been worker and community oriented and coming together around a crisis and to resolve that quickly, but also from a really solid understanding of what difference looks like in the moment. There are other examples of co-ops here in Vancouver that completely have taken on, very non-white, not able centering dynamics. There's a Chilean co-op that was formed by Chilean immigrants on the east side of Vancouver. And so I've spent time going over there for community projects and for cultural projects, and it's completely different experience than what I have in the place where, where I grew up. And so I think I want to leave it there and leave it open for questions. But again, I guess I just want to, I want to highlight and echo everything that Dr. Jan said. In that all of these aspects need to be taken into consideration. And why I say that now is the time is because I currently sit on the advisory for racialized and cultural communities at the City of Vancouver, and there's other advisory groups, so on housing and on arts and culture. And it's specifically right now that we need to be looking at when we talk about, for example, affordability, and we talk about inclusion, and we talk about accessibility, who are the groups and the peoples that keep being left off as more of the afterthought, right? And the amount of work that needs to go in again from the beginning and setting these structures up. And also remembering, we all know that visual, right, of equity. So you've got the stack up, right? That equity is not equality. And so when you're talking about affordability, for example, if you're talking about that being, there's new co-ops around South Fraser area, and those are the ones that CHFBC always responds like they have more open membership. How affordable are they actually? And who are the members that will be living in them, from different racialized groups to people with different abilities and disabilities? And not, I think we also have to shatter a lot of our concepts around still age and leadership. So on the one hand, a lot of the co-ops in Vancouver, because they were created in the 80s, they do have a higher senior population, which has pros and cons. Maybe those aren't the best words to use, but there's this, what's been often created are dynamics where youth are not empowered, as I was mentioning earlier, to take on leadership positions. But on the other side as well, where the seniors are treated as, you know, when co-ops can no longer provide subsidy, when they're at a point where seniors are no longer per se a priority of support, they also become sort of an afterthought. So it's both of those. But also in our current COVID and post-COVID financial crisis situation, what does supporting students and the younger groups who may not want to live necessarily in a multiple roommate structure or a smaller, they may want to live independently within an independent suite, but within a broader cooperative dynamic, what affordability and supporting them will look like, you know, and is that, you know, typically what most universities have deemed affordable, which is incredible for a person by themselves, incredibly expensive, you know, for a person by themselves that's younger, with a lot of debt and you know, probably other struggles. And again, add on if they're racialized and they're navigating mental health. And mental health is the other aspect I want to throw in there right before I finish off. And when we talk about ability and disability and inclusion, mental health and specific to the context of Vancouver that we're in is a huge crisis. And unfortunately, it cannot be monitored or proven and sometimes there's marginalization that happens in requesting for documentation in relation to mental health as a disability or a struggle. And considering right now that we have decades of racism existing in Vancouver, Vancouver being a place where, you know, people couldn't even own property. People of color could not own property in neighborhoods like Point Grey or Shaughnessy. Like this was stratified in paper, in documentation. And so we have to consider how mental health has unfolded generationally and how it impacts intergenerationally those that have been growing up, you know, suffering various layers of marginalization and struggle and having to, you know, hop through many hoops, you know. And I think that if the work is done right now in the moment that new visions of co-ops are being constructed, what we could see is a pivot. So we could support families to either be in co-ops for the time that they need, especially younger, either single or non-traditional structures. And that's something else, is that I think cooperatives in BC right now are having to grapple with the over and under housing crisis in Vancouver. So I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with that, but that looks like in co-ops is very specific mandates around who would be considered over and under housed. And usually the simplest way to delineate that is number of heads, right? Number of adult heads in that unit. So if you have 2 bedrooms, you would need at least 2 people living in that unit. And there's a lot of other considerations that need to be taken into account, like cultural dynamics, again, mental health dynamics. And if they are, what I was going to say earlier was, we could see, if we take this into account, the empowerment of a certain population right now to feel supported and engage with cooperative housing structure and other structures when they need it, and then perhaps either leave and pass the space, pass the torch, keep participating in certain ways, or remain for the long term with the experience that they've developed, right? But there does have to be a population shift. in the current, specifically the West City of Vancouver cooperative structures, there have to be governance shifts. Like, I think we actually have to completely rethink what governance and leadership looks like in the co-ops that we have right now in the Lower Mainland of BC, and also the physical makeup, and of course. And by physical makeup, I mean, again, accessibility, and not just of the ramps, but physical. Every time you engage in space together, can everybody hear each other? Can everybody sit comfortably or stand or participate comfortably? And again, I am cognizant that there is the big financial, all of this concept of the co-op and the praxis of it falls under, financial limitations and financial tasks that have to be taken into consideration. So that's where I'll leave it at. And if anybody has questions, I definitely welcome them. Thank you.